Electronic drummers that mostly want to use software drums or VSTs on their computer and don't need all of the onboard sounds and features of a regular drum module may already be aware of Audiofront's eDRUMin trigger modules. I've very kindly been lent an eDRUMin 10 by a viewer of the channel, Stephen Mackrill, to test for a few weeks and to do a review. Spoiler alert, I'm very impressed with it, but it isn't for everyone. Let's get to it. Hey, welcome back to the eDrum Workshop. I'm Luke and I hope you're having a great day. If you're completely unfamiliar with the eDRUMin modules and you have no idea what they're for or why you would want to use one, here's a quick introduction. They're trigger modules that contain no onboard sounds, screen, knobs or dials, and are fully compatible with a range of different pads from different manufacturers. Think basically just the connections and the trigger processing capabilities of a regular drum module. In place of a screen and dials, it comes with a really robust piece of counterpart software for your computer that you hook it up to in order to make detailed trigger changes like setting pad types and presets for different brands, adjusting the fine details of trigger parameters, setting up your pedals, and adjusting things like the MIDI notes that it will send out. You can then use the eDRUMin to control drum software or VSTs like Superior Drummer, Stephen Slate Drums, Addictive Drums, or you can use it as a standalone device without a computer hooked up to a module. And this works because all of the changes to the settings that you make on the control app get automatically stored within the device. I'll go into more detail of both of those uses shortly along with the software. Visually, it's a very simple and unassuming little box. On this 10 input version, you've got 10 stereo jack inputs on the front for drum pads or triggers, and each of those can be split with a regular splitter cable, 2 additional jacks on the back specifically for pedals, which can be hi-hat pedals, foot switches, or even expression or sustain pedals, a USB host port, a USB printer cable style port for hooking up to a computer, a 9-volt power adapter socket for when you're not using the USB, and a MIDI in and a MIDI out port. All this capability in a tiny box like this is brilliant, and it's clear that there's no wasted space here. Price wise, at the time of recording, you're looking at $329 for the eDRUMin 10 plus shipping depending on where you are. You can order it with a USB cable for a small extra charge, and it doesn't come with a power adapter because it's not necessary for most applications. There is a recommended power adapter in the manual and I've got the UK version of it. It works, what more can I say? If you want to run this with a VST or some other kind of audio software for your sounds, there's a few things that you're going to need to keep in mind. One is that you'll need some knowledge of setting this up in the first place. If you've already used VSTs with a module before, then you'll be pretty familiar with the process. But if you've got no idea what a digital audio workstation is, you don't know what VSTs or drum software are, then you'll need to do some research to decide whether or not this is something that you want to dive into. The eDRUMin will take care of the processing of your triggers and sending out the MIDI data to any software that you might want to run, but it's your computer that's going to be doing the heavy lifting in terms of running the software and producing the audio that you're going to hear as a result of using this device. To run some software, you might need pretty decent specs on your computer. A decent amount of RAM, a good processor, quite a lot of hard drive space for example. And also you might need something like an audio interface to handle the audio side of these applications. The eDRUMin itself is very fast, as quick as any good drum module, but your computer will still need to be able to run that software at low latency in order to get the best results. And this is also the case with certain drum modules too, but it's something that you might want to consider before diving in. Once you hook the eDRUMin up to a computer and you open the software, its controls are really nicely laid out, reasonably intuitive and very deep, but this will be some people's first stumbling block because there's quite a bit of a learning curve depending on your current knowledge of how electronic drums work. For beginners, this isn't as easy to get to grips with as the trigger settings on a Roland module for example, and at first it might appear quite overwhelming. However, if you're happy to do some reading, the manual is genuinely helpful and it explains the concepts and steps really clearly. You don't get this level of graphic representation on any drum module that I know of, and it gives you a really clear reference point for what each control is doing. To start with, you've got your visual representation of each pad input at the top. There's also a device icon here displaying what eDRUMin device or devices you have have connected. When you select a pad either by clicking on it or hitting the pad if you have the auto select on, you can then choose from pad type options underneath. There's settings that cover the bulk of general pad setups, from center mesh and side mesh to rubber pads, Yamaha pads, acoustic triggers, and various types of cymbal pad. There are also some other options to the side of this. You can choose whether this input is a stereo pad, a mono pad, or a split of two mono pads. As you can see, I've got one input split here, so I can choose independent settings for each. There's also a preset manager here that's got some popular manufacturer pad presets built in, and you can filter these by brand or pad type. You can also save your own presets here too if you dial a pad in really well and want to make sure you've saved it, or to share with other people over on the Audiofront forum. Then there's also a button for Yamaha style wiring in case your pad is configured that way. Next up is the calibrate button, which is a really handy way to quickly dial in a pad. I'd say it probably gets you about 80 to 90% of the way there, at least with the pads that I've tried. But then a lot of my pads are really finicky DIY pads or third-party triggers. There are details in the manual for the best way to calibrate your pads. Below this are the finer details of the trigger settings. I'm not going to go too heavily into this here as it's a topic that could fill an entire video, but in a nutshell, the gain is like the sensitivity control in many other modules. It brings up or down the overall signal level of the pad, and this will affect all aspects of how it responds. The threshold is the minimum signal level that you want it to treat as a trigger signal, so if you set this too high, you'll lose your ghost notes, and if you set it too low, you might get false triggers from the noise floor. Then the scan, hold, and decay settings are all settings that look at different parts of the waveform to determine which was the main intended hit, and which fluctuations might need to be ironed out to give you consistent and accurate triggering. Again, the manual explains each of these really well. Once you've got your triggers going, over on the right you can adjust the trigger curve. Rather than having set curves like Roland modules, you can fine-tune the response with these two Bezier handles, and you can also set the minimum and maximum MIDI values. Everyone's playing style is different, and what feels like a natural dynamic range and response to me might not to you. So being able to tweak this really heavily to adapt it to your playing style is a massive bonus. On the bottom row you get the crosstalk control for each pad. This is a pretty standard feature on drum modules, and it's well handled and works well on the eDRUMin. Next to this you then get to the controls that differ depending on the pad type. For example, the snare that I'm using is a dual zone side trigger, and it gives me controls for the rim shot range and the cross stick and rim shot response scaling. The rim shot range in particular is incredibly useful, and it let me dial in really fine-tuned rim response that picks up both rim clicks and even low velocity rim shots on my snare. The cross stick and rim shot scalers let you adjust the dynamic response of each of these articulations. If I then go on to the split input, I've got a mono kick drum pad, and I'm also using my center cone rack tom here. Because it's a center cone, I get the option of hotspot suppression and positional sensing, and with it being wired up in mono with this split input, I also get the option of using the edge sense control. This is a really cool feature that attempts to detect where you're hitting on the pad and creates an extra edge zone purely off the waveform. How well it works will depend on the pad. If I go over to this other center trigger I'm using with positional sensing turned on, you get this positional sensing control box. There's a video by Audiofront that really helps with setting these up correctly, but basically if the little red line is over to the right, that is effectively the center of the pad. If it goes over to the left, that's the very edge, and then you adjust this green box in the middle to set the middle range transitions between the center and the edge. I'll show off how these features work in action in the next section. For my ride pad, I'm using an ATV 18-inch pad, and I've got it wired up with both inputs like on a Roland module, as this gave me the best results. So it gives me the option of the scalers for the edge and the bell zones. For my left crash, I'm using a CY15R hooked up as a 2-zone pad, but once again there's a really cool feature that lets you access an extra zone, the bell sense option. Again, this uses some pretty clever waveform detection to work out where you're hitting the pad, and it creates an extra zone purely from this. You can swap between bell sense presets for the CY8, CY13R and CY15R. Again, I'll show this off properly shortly. I've also got my Yamaha PCY135 pad hooked up as my hi-hat, and it works with all 3 zones on one cable, meaning that I can set up a 3-zone hi-hat with software that supports it. This input is linked to the hi-hat pedal, which you can find settings for in the pedal editor pages. In the bottom right corner, there are the MIDI settings for each pad, the MIDI channel, the note number associated with each zone, so center, side stick and rim shot, or bow, bell, edge, etc. An option to make the cymbal choke send as a MIDI note rather than aftertouch for certain VSTs or software like Ableton Live, and the CC number of the position data if you're using positional sensing. There's also this drum map box that you can use to set up the MIDI notes according to the standards used by different manufacturers. So for example, if you've got a snare and you want to use the MIDI notes that Roland normally associates with a snare, you select your pad, click this drum map box, select Roland from the map type, and then select the snare drum from this little graphic. And now the notes change to the Roland mappings. This is a fantastic inclusion and it makes things really streamlined. There's also a toggle to swap between standard and advanced mode up at the top that enables a few extra features. When it's enabled on this page, you get the option to independently map a velocity curve for each zone, and it also enables MIDI note banks for each pad. This lets you store up to 4 different note assignments for each pad if you end up using different software or hardware that requires changes, or if you want to swap a pad to another instrument or something. You can toggle between these either by clicking on them or by using a pedal input if you want to, and you can do that for either the whole kit or for individual instruments. This is another brilliant feature, but I can see why it's been hidden on the standard settings, as it's not going to be needed for everybody. Speaking of pedals, on the eDRUMin 10 you can have 2 pedals, and it can actually detect the pedal that you're using if you choose, or you can set it up manually. I'm using a Roland FD7 pedal here and it's in hi-hat mode. You can swap to different pedal types and different modes up here. You can change the response curve similarly to the trigger curves. There are settings to fine-tune crosstalk and threshold for the hi-hat chick, and even controls for the sensitivity of the foot splash. You can swap between different detection modes, and there are some fixes for various issues that people might run into when using VSTs or other software. The CC only with hit option is really useful if you get weird artifacts with a VST. I'm using it with Superior Drummer 2, and if you turn this off, you can do cool things like slightly opening and closing the hi-hat with the pedal after you've hit it. However, even though this is great for realism, you can sometimes get janky effects with different movements of the pedal, especially if you're like me and your footwork's a bit sloppy. So you can swap to CC only with hit to make it only send the pedal information when you hit the pad. There's such a huge scope for the settings in this software, but I'll have to cap it off and move on because there's just too much to cover. Needless to say, this software is a huge selling point for the eDRUMin, and it provides some of the best tweakability for pad performance that I've ever tried. If you enjoy eDrums and you feel like you need more control than you can get out of your module, this will give you that control. The fact that these settings are then stored within the unit itself for use away from the computer is massively useful. When I was going over the software, I highlighted quite a few unique features, so I'm going to zero in on the ones that I've tested, talk a bit more about them and show off the performance of them rather than just the dials and the controls. There's one main thing to keep in mind across all of these features, and that is that the build of your pad matters. If you've got off-the-shelf pads by manufacturers like Roland and Yamaha, the features will likely work really well with those because they've been designed around those pads. The rimshot range feature and the other rim-related controls gave me really good results on my drone halo trigger that's inside my 13-inch snare, but they've not been all that easy to dial in on my tom pads. My 12-inch tom pad is a quite badly thrown together DIY trigger, and my 14-inch floor tom pad is an Alesis strike pad that broke and that I fixed and has never really functioned as well as it should since. But the response of these pads has been equally bad on any other module too. And the same goes for the edge sense feature. On my 12-inch rack tom it doesn't work very well at all. No matter how much I try dialing it in as per the manual, I can't get it working quite right. But on the flip side, on this other 12-inch drum using a borrowed Jabeki trigger, it works almost flawlessly. So depending on the build of your pad, you may or may not want to use this as your main source of rim triggering. To try out the positional sensing and the hotspot suppression, I used that 12-inch pad with the borrowed Jabeki trigger inside it that I mentioned before. Using this trigger, I've had pretty good results with the positional sensing. The hotspot suppression is working a little bit, but not all that much. But what I did notice about this trigger in particular is that it's actually very hot. Even with the gain settings on a minimum, it's really easy to top out the meter with a medium stroke. So I spoke to Rob from Audiofront because I had a feeling that this hot signal might have been affecting the hotspot suppression, and his reply pretty much confirmed that that's the case. Here's his reply up on the screen, but essentially it boils down to the waveform analysis needing a clean signal that isn't clipping, and different A to E conversions, triggers, or any variable in a build can affect the signal and how well the hotspot suppression can work. The suppression was designed around a Roland PD-125 and a DDT MS-140C, which are both well-built pads and are pretty representative of gear that's designed for positional sensing. So if you've got Roland pads or pads that have been designed like Roland pads, then you're probably going to get pretty good results with these settings. If you're using DIY or third-party triggers, it will depend on the construction of the trigger as to how well these settings will work. You do get plenty of controls for dialing things in though, so it's definitely worth persevering. If it's a DIY trigger that you've built yourself and you're happy to experiment with the build, then you'll probably also be able to dial in pretty good results. The bell sense feature works scarily accurately with my CY15R symbol with the correct preset, and it's actually giving me better bell response than my Roland module when I use the tip of the stick to play it. However, if I hit with the shoulder of the stick, it pretty much always gives me the bow. There are also reports on the Audiofront forums that the ATV 18-inch symbol works really well with the bell sense setting for the CY8, but personally I couldn't get it to function accurately. I was getting a lot of errant bell hits on the bow and I was getting quite a lot of bow hits on the bell. I also couldn't get anything usable out of the lemon symbols that I tried either. So again, you're going to get the best results when using the pads that these features have been designed around or have presets for. But of course it's still worth experimenting because you might get surprising results. The USB host port is another great feature that really opens up a lot of capabilities with this device. I've talked about USB MIDI hosts before, specifically the Kenton USB MIDI host, and the eDRUMin 10 can do all of the same things with its host port too. You can even use a USB hub in the host port to host up to 4 devices. So this could be multiple eDRUMin units, or it could be drum modules that support MIDI over USB like the current generation of Roland modules. And what's really cool about the eDRUMin's host port is that it applies crosstalk cancellation across all of the devices connected. The Roland digital pads are class compliant and work as MIDI devices when you hook them up to a computer or a USB host. So naturally, like I did with the Kenton, I tried both of these pads out on the eDRUMin. Unfortunately, I don't have a USB hub, so I couldn't try them both together, but separately they work just as well as they do when you hook them up to a computer or when you use the Kenton. It's not entirely necessary to do this if you're hooking up to a computer because you can just plug it into a USB port on your computer, but if you do want to use this in standalone mode then the option's there. One thing that I did ask of Rob here was whether it would be possible to affect the MIDI data that's being sent from the digital pads. Personally, I'd really love to be able to use the setting where you can change the choke to a MIDI note with the digital ride. This would allow me to use the cymbal choke properly on the Mimic Pro via the eDRUMin. He said that this is a possibility, but at the moment it's a bit too niche of a feature to focus on, which is fair enough. I also ran my TD17 entirely off pads hooked up just to the eDRUMin using the host port. So no triggers hooked up to the TD17, just running the power cable, headphones and the USB MIDI cable connected to the eDRUMin. And the eDRUMin was running in standalone mode using the power supply. It functioned really well with all the settings that I'd saved. And because the eDRUMin is handling all of the triggering and then just sending MIDI notes to the TD17, you can use pads like the Yamaha 3-zone cymbals to their full capability by assigning the correct MIDI notes. And just to clear up any confusion here, the eDRUMin isn't creating any extra or hidden zones. What I've done here is I've split the assignments on the auxiliary pad input to 2 different sounds, and then I've used layering and tuning to adjust the settings. The MIDI notes coming from the hi-hat bell and the crash bell are then assigned to each of the MIDI notes on the aux pad input. So I sacrificed the auxiliary instrument in order to do this. I've not unlocked some crazy secret zones or anything. Some modules like the Pearl Mimic Pro, some Yamaha modules and some older Roland modules will let you expand their inputs by using MIDI. I did a really in-depth MIDI video explaining this concept a while ago that you can go check out if you're interested, because I'm not going to spend any more time on that here. I'm really impressed with the eDRUMin 10 so far, and I'll actually be pretty gutted when I've got to send it back. Even though I'm not really a big VST user myself, I can see lots of applications that this would come in useful for. So I'll probably find a way of justifying a purchase down the line. It's also great that Rob is really responsive and seemingly releases updates really frequently. But even if the updates stop today, there's already so many features included. And ultimately that's what you need to be looking at when you buy a product, what it can currently do. The Audiofront forums are a great resource too. There's a thread containing unofficially supported pads and user settings, a subforum for sharing presets, and it appears that you can get pretty quick knowledgeable responses from Rob or other users. So who is this for? Well, if you're running a setup where you don't need a module's internal sounds as you're using software, you want great pad compatibility either with your stock manufacturer pads, or because you've got a wide range of different pads, or you feel like you want to go up a level with your trigger response because your module's not cutting it for you, and you're pretty well versed with trigger settings and MIDI, the eDRUMin 10 is a brilliant product for this. It can handle up to 20 pads if you want to split them, and with the right pads you can even get multiple zones out of them when they're split. Or even if you don't want to split your inputs off, it can handle a 5-piece kit with hi-hats, a Roland style 2-cable ride and 2 crashes comfortably. The setup that I'm using is only splitting 1 input, and that's for the kick and the rack tom, and the only reason that I did that is so that I could use a BT1 pad on its own input. Overall, it's handled the majority of things that I've thrown at it better than expected, and the only things it struggled with were pads that were already troublesome on other modules. On the flip side, this might not be for you if you're brand new to electronic drums, you don't have a lot of experience with deep diving into trigger settings, or you'd prefer to stick with stock setups that are a bit more plug and play, or you aren't interested in using VSTs or expanding a module via MIDI. It does have a bit of a learning curve, though nothing too unobtainable without a bit of reading, and some of the features might be beyond the scope of more simple uses of electronic drums. However, it's still worth keeping an eye on if you plan on sticking with electronic drums for the long run, as it seemingly just keeps on getting better and is really well supported. I really hope you enjoyed this review. If you did, please pop a like on it, subscribe to the channel for more like this, and check out the eDrumworkshop.com for new kits or samples for your electronic drum module. Above all, have a great day and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!